You don't feel it enter. You feel the itch, maybe. A mosquito, a warm evening, the kind of night the Romans built entire villas to enjoy. You slap your arm a second too late, and by then something the size of a single cell is already swimming through your bloodstream like it owns the place, which for the next 2 weeks it will. I've spent more of my career than I'd like to admit thinking about this organism, not because it's rare, not because it's exotic, but because it might be the most successful assassin in human history, and almost nobody puts it on the list of things that ended an empire. Rome didn't fall because of one battle. It didn't fall because of one bad emperor, though God knows there were candidates. Somewhere in the last few centuries of its decline, a parasite smaller than the period at the end of this sentence was quietly moving through the bloodstreams of senators, soldiers, farmers, and slaves, and it may have done more damage to the Roman world than any army Rome ever faced. This is the story of Plasmodium falciparum, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will never think about a mosquito bite the same way again. Here's the part that still gets me, every single time. Malaria doesn't attack you directly, it attacks your red blood cells. It hijacks the exact cells your body built to carry oxygen and turns them into tiny biological delivery trucks for its own reproduction. A female anopheles mosquito bites you, only females by the way, because they're the ones that need a blood meal to develop their eggs. Evolution's version of it's not personal, it's parental. As she feeds, she injects saliva loaded with sporozoites, the parasite's infectious form, straight into your skin. From there, they don't dawdle. Within about 30 minutes, they've found their way into your bloodstream and are heading directly for your liver. Your immune system, to its credit, is watching this happen. Unfortunately, your immune system is a little like airport security run by caffeinated raccoons, extremely alert, occasionally effective, and constantly one step behind whoever actually knows what they're doing. The parasite slips into liver cells and goes quiet. This is the part almost nobody feels. No fever, no symptoms. Just a silent, several-day renovation project happening inside your liver, where a single sporozoite multiplies into tens of thousands of new parasites, called merozoites. Then, all at once, your liver cells rupture and thousands of merozoites pour into your bloodstream like a dam breaking. That's when the real war begins. Each merozoite has one target, your red blood cells, and it doesn't break in through the front door. It has a specific protein. For a falciparum, it's called PFEMP1, that acts like a key cut for a very particular lock on the surface of your red blood cells. Once inside, the parasite does something almost insulting in its efficiency. It eats your hemoglobin. It uses your own oxygen-carrying protein as fuel and leaves behind a toxic byproduct called hemozoin, basically biological waste the parasite can't digest, so it just stores it inside you, like a squatter leaving garbage bags in your hallway. Over the next 48 hours, the parasite multiplies inside that one red blood cell until it bursts, releasing 8 to 24 new merozoites, each one ready to invade a fresh cell. This is why malaria fevers come in cycles. Every 48 hours, in perfect synchrony, millions of red blood cells burst at nearly the same moment, dumping parasite waste and cellular debris into your bloodstream all at once. Your immune system reacts the way anyone would if a bomb blew up in the building next door. Massive inflammation, spiking fever, teeth-chattering chills, and a body that suddenly feels like it's trying to cook itself from the inside. The Romans didn't know about red blood cells or merozoites, but they absolutely knew the pattern. They even had a name for it. They called it the tertian fever, striking every third day, counting inclusively the way the Romans counted everything. And when it came from the marshlands surrounding their own capital, they called it something else. Roman fever. Here's the part that always struck me as almost cruelly elegant. Falciparum doesn't just infect red blood cells, it changes them. It builds tiny protein knobs on the surface of the infected cell, and those knobs act like Velcro, sticking the infected cell to the walls of tiny vessels throughout your body. Why would a parasite want to do that? Because your spleen is constantly patrolling your bloodstream, filtering out damaged or unusual red blood cells and destroying them. That's the immune system's cleanup crew. If infected red blood cells floated freely, your spleen would filter them out and kill them before the parasite finished its 48-hour reproduction cycle. So falciparum essentially teaches infected cells to hide. It sticks them to the walls of tiny vessels in your organs, your brain, your kidneys, your placenta if you're pregnant, keeping them out of general circulation and out of your spleen's crosshairs. This is also exactly why falciparum is the deadliest of the malaria species. When infected cells clog the small vessels feeding your brain, you get cerebral malaria, swelling, seizures, coma. When they clog the vessels feeding the placenta, you get some of the highest maternal and infant mortality rates in infectious disease.
The parasite isn't trying to kill you, by the way. Dead hosts don't spread malaria. It's trying to survive long enough to be sucked back up by another mosquito and passed along. You dying is just an unfortunate rounding error in its business plan. Fast fact: a person with severe falciparum malaria can have up to 2 million parasites in every microliter of blood. A microliter is smaller than a raindrop. You're a Roman legionary, stationed near the marshes outside the capital in late summer, the season the locals already fear without fully understanding why. You don't feel anything unusual for about a week after that mosquito bite near the drainage ditch. You're marching, training, eating your rations, entirely unaware that your liver has just finished quietly manufacturing an army. Then, one afternoon, you feel cold, not a little chilly, cold enough that you're shivering under a summer sun, teeth clattering, wrapping yourself in whatever cloak you can find while your fellow soldiers look at you like you've lost your mind. An hour later, you're burning, fever spiking past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, your head is pounding, your joints ache like you've been beaten. Then, just as suddenly, it breaks. You're drenched in sweat, exhausted, and for about a day, you feel almost normal. Then it happens again, exactly on schedule. The Roman physicians watching this pattern didn't have microscopes, they didn't have germ theory, but they had something almost as valuable: relentless observation. And what they observed was that certain marshy, low-lying regions produced this fever again and again in cycles every single year in the exact same season. They just didn't know why. Your immune system, faced with a parasite it's never successfully evolved to eliminate, does something that sounds almost desperate when you say it out loud. It tries to burn the invader out. Fever isn't a malfunction, it's a strategy. Many pathogens replicate less efficiently at higher temperatures, and your immune cells actually work faster in a slightly warmer environment. So your hypothalamus, your brain's internal thermostat, deliberately resets your body's target temperature upward. The problem is that falciparum is remarkably tolerant of fever. It has survived alongside humans so long, it's essentially built a resistance to our best internal weapon. So the fever keeps escalating, the immune response keeps escalating, and eventually the very inflammation meant to save you starts becoming the thing that hurts you. This is one of the strange running truths of infectious disease. Sometimes the disease doesn't kill you, your own immune system's overcorrection does. In 2001, a British malariologist named Robert Salares published an entire book making the historical case that malaria, specifically falciparum malaria, was endemic across large parts of ancient Italy, especially the marshy regions surrounding Rome itself. Then, in 2016, a team of researchers led by Stephanie Marciniak analyzed skeletal remains from 3 imperial-era Roman cemeteries and successfully recovered ancient DNA fragments consistent with Plasmodium falciparum, direct molecular evidence that malaria was circulating in the population during the height of the Roman Empire. That's not folklore, that's not speculation dressed up as history, that's genetic evidence pulled directly out of 2,000-year-old bones. And when you combine that molecular evidence with the mountain of written testimony from Roman physicians, poets, and historians describing recurring marshy fevers around the capital, the picture becomes very hard to ignore. Roman writers didn't know what malaria was, but they knew where it lived. They blamed it on the air itself, malaria, literally bad air in later Italian, describing the noxious vapors believed to rise from swamps and stagnant water. It's actually where the disease gets its modern name, even though the real culprit wasn't the air, it was what was breeding beneath it. The marshlands surrounding Rome, the Pontine marshes to the south, low-lying areas along the Tiber, stagnant pools left behind by flooding, were essentially five-star real estate for anopheles mosquitoes. Wealthy Romans who could afford to leave the city during late summer often did exactly that, retreating to hill towns and coastal villas during the exact months we now know coincide with peak mosquito activity. They didn't understand the mechanism, but they understood the pattern well enough to build an entire seasonal migration around avoiding it.
True or false? Malaria alone destroyed the Roman Empire. Verdict: false. No serious historian or epidemiologist claims malaria single-handedly toppled Rome. Empires collapse from an accumulation of pressures: economic strain, political instability, invasions, plagues, agricultural failure, administrative fragmentation. Malaria wasn't the sword, it was closer to a slow leak in the hull. What malaria almost certainly did was weaken the empire from the inside for centuries, depressing birth rates in endemic regions, reducing agricultural productivity in the most fertile Italian farmland, killing infants and pregnant women at devastating rates, and eroding the health and stamina of the very population Rome depended on to farm, fight, and administer its territory. It didn't need to be the final blow. It just needed to make every other crisis harder to survive. Here's something that surprised me the first time I read the research, and it still does. Falciparum malaria disproportionately devastates pregnant women. Pregnancy naturally suppresses parts of the immune system to prevent the body from rejecting the fetus, and that suppression leaves pregnant women dramatically more vulnerable to severe malaria. Infected red blood cells preferentially stick to receptors in placental tissue, starving the developing fetus of oxygen and nutrients. The result, historically and even today in endemic regions, is elevated rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, low birth weight, and maternal death. Now, stretch that across the fertile lowlands of central Italy, some of Rome's most productive agricultural territory, over the course of several centuries. You don't get a sudden collapse, you get something quieter and, in some ways, more corrosive, a gradual demographic drag on exactly the regions the empire needed to stay strong. Fewer healthy children, fewer laborers, fewer soldiers born and raised in the Roman heartland itself, eventually forcing the empire to rely more and more heavily on recruiting soldiers from its frontier provinces, a shift historians already link to later instability in the Roman military. Not everyone exposed to malaria gets equally sick, and the reason is one of the strangest examples of evolution making a brutal trade in real time. In parts of the world where falciparum malaria has circulated for thousands of years, you find unusually high rates of a genetic mutation that causes sickle cell trait. A single copy of that mutation slightly deforms red blood cells, not enough to cause sickle cell disease, but just enough to make it much harder for the malaria parasite to complete its life cycle inside them. It's a brutal kind of natural selection. 2 copies of the mutation can cause a severe blood disorder. 1 copy can protect you from dying of malaria. Populations exposed to malaria for enough generations essentially got locked into that trade-off, whether they chose it or not. There is ongoing historical debate about how significant this specific mutation was in the ancient Italian population versus other malaria-protective traits like thalassemia, which is also unusually common in parts of Italy and the Mediterranean to this day. Some researchers argue this elevated prevalence of blood disorders across Mediterranean populations is itself an evolutionary echo of centuries of relentless malarial pressure. That's what I mean when I say the parasite isn't trying to ruin your day. Evolution doesn't have a sense of humor, but if it did, this would be its idea of a punchline. The disease was so deadly for so long, entire populations rewrote their own blood chemistry just to survive it. Roman physicians were not incompetent. Some of their observational medicine was genuinely impressive for the era. But they were working entirely without the 2 concepts modern medicine depends on most: germ theory and the mosquito vector.
They tried bloodletting, they tried herbal remedies, they tried moving patients to different climates, which ironically sometimes worked, not because the bad air theory was correct, but because moving away from mosquito-dense marshland accidentally removed the actual cause of transmission. There's a bitter kind of irony in medical history here. For nearly 2,000 years, doctors treated malaria's symptom pattern correctly, recognizing the fever cycles, associating the disease with marshy geography, advising seasonal relocation, while being completely wrong about why any of it worked. It wasn't until 1880 that a French army doctor named Charles Louis Alphonse Leveron, working in Algeria, looked through a microscope at the blood of a feverish soldier and saw something moving that shouldn't have been there. He'd found the parasite itself. It took another 17 years, in 1897, for a British officer named Ronald Ross to prove that mosquitoes were the ones actually transmitting it. Rome fell over 1,000 years before anyone on Earth understood what was likely been quietly killing its citizens for generations. Here's a detail that still makes me laugh in the darkest possible way. The first effective malaria treatment humanity ever discovered didn't come from Rome, and it didn't come from understanding the parasite at all. It came from Peru, from the bark of the cinchona tree, which indigenous populations in South America had used for fevers long before Europeans arrived.
The active compound, later isolated and named quinine, works by interfering with the malaria parasite's ability to safely process the toxic byproducts of digesting your hemoglobin, essentially poisoning the parasite's own waste disposal system until it kills itself with its own garbage. Europeans spent centuries dying of a disease that had unknowingly already been treatable on a different continent the entire time. Global trade routes eventually carried cinchona bark to Europe by the 1600s, over a millennium after the fall of Rome, far too late to save the empire that, in some ways, may have needed it most. Sometimes the tragedy of medical history isn't that we didn't have answers, it's that the answer was on the wrong side of an ocean. Quinine derivatives are still used today, thousands of years after Rome, in modern anti-malarial drugs. Your own family may have taken a distant chemical descendant of a treatment discovered in the Andes without ever knowing it shares ancestry with a Roman-era mystery fever. Here's something that should genuinely unsettle you a little. Malaria wasn't eliminated from Italy through some dramatic ancient medical breakthrough. It persisted for nearly 2,000 years after Rome's fall. The Pontine Marshes remained a malaria stronghold well into the 20th century. It took a massive, sustained public health campaign, draining wetlands, using insecticides, and eventually a coordinated eradication program in the 1930s and 40s before Italy was finally declared malaria-free in 1970. Think about that timeline. The disease that may have quietly weakened the empire that built the Colosseum was still infecting Italian farmers during the era of television. That's not ancient history staying in the past. That's ancient history refusing to leave. I want to be careful here because this is where a lot of popular history goes wrong, and I promised you scientific honesty over sensationalism. Historians overwhelmingly agree Rome's decline was multi-causal: economic instability, currency devaluation, overextended borders, repeated civil wars, administrative fragmentation between East and West, invasions and migrations of neighboring peoples, and yes, other infectious diseases, including the devastating Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, both likely caused by different pathogens entirely. Malaria's role is best understood as a chronic stressor, not a singular cause. It's the difference between a disease that delivers a knockout punch and a disease that spends centuries quietly draining the fighter's stamina before the final round even starts. What makes falciparum malaria historically significant isn't that it was dramatic, it's that it was relentless. Every single summer for centuries in the exact fertile regions Rome depended on most. An empire can survive a war. It has a much harder time surviving an enemy that shows up without fail every single year indefinitely and never has to win, it just has to keep showing up. Some historians have even speculated that malaria's severity around the city of Rome may have made the capital a strategically difficult target for certain invading forces unfamiliar with the local disease burden, meaning the same parasite that weakened Rome from within may have occasionally protected it from outside armies who fell ill after arriving, nature once again refusing to pick a side. Malaria still infects an enormous number of people worldwide every single year, overwhelmingly across sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America. This isn't ancient history. This is Tuesday somewhere on Earth right now. So here's what I actually want you to remember, not as trivia but as something useful. If you're traveling to a region where malaria is endemic, anti-malarial prophylaxis exists and works. Take it exactly as prescribed, not when you remember. Fevers that come in cycles, especially after travel to a malaria-endemic region, are a medical emergency, not a waited-out situation. Falciparum malaria can go from mild symptoms to cerebral malaria in a matter of days. And maybe the next time you're somewhere warm, near still water, and something small lands on your arm, you'll remember that this exact interaction, repeated silently across a fertile stretch of ancient Italy for centuries, may have helped quietly erode one of the most powerful empires humanity ever built. Not with an invasion, not with a battle, with something smaller than the cell it was hiding in. Medicine has a way of making the terrifying things feel a little less terrifying once you actually understand the mechanism behind them. Rome didn't fall to a monster, it fell to biology. Patient, relentless, indifferent biology. The same biology that's still running inside every one of us right now, whether we're paying attention to it or not. I think that's worth finding fascinating instead of frightening. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.